Good morning. Um, the camera was not working this morning for Found in Translation Session 2. But I know some people are just watching the recordings, so I thought it would be necessary to re-record Session 2 so those people would still have the ability to keep up with the class. So this isn't going to be as dynamic as working with a live class and playing off of people in a room, but here we are. This is what we're going to have to do, and hopefully I'll figure out what the problem was so that it never happens again in future sessions. So I'm going to begin by unpacking this image from where we ended last session. We ended on this idea that all language is a partnership, and we were talking about the idea of semantic range, the idea that every word in a language has a range of possible meanings, and that in our brains we have what I call an encyclopedia, which tracks all of those possible meanings, and then in a given situation chooses the correct one, but is also aware of the others, and therefore can sometimes mean multiple things at the same time. And even if you don't intentionally mean multiple things at the same time, we may imply or infer some of those meanings without even without even necessarily realizing that that's what we're doing. Last week somebody mentioned they were reading a French Bible. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cough. And in the French Bible they were reading Matthew 5:5, which in English says the meek will inherit the earth. And in French it said the debonair will inherit the earth. And her point was that what they meant in French was that those people who take things gracefully. So meek and debonair may have similar denotations, that is, strict definitions, but because they have really different semantic ranges, we think one as maybe meaning kind of wimpy and the other as meaning like well-dressed, which are really, really different ideas. So being aware of semantic range helps you to clue into that is even happening in the first place. And we're going to work through this class to expand our reader encyclopedia to be more closely aligned to the author's encyclopedia, so that whatever the original authors intended is what we're able to actually read from the Bible. So this image a little bit. On the left, we have the author's encyclopedia, which if you want to communicate something, you're going to filter that idea through your encyclopedia to create a text, which can then be interpreted by the reader or listener. Text has an asterisk by it because in literary theory, text does not necessarily mean written word. The words that I'm speaking right now are the text. Now, in the case of the Bible, we are talking about written words, but I think it's important to recognize that what we're doing is not unique to Scripture or to biblical interpretation. It's a feature of all language. And it just kind of gets ramped up when you look at something like the Bible, which is an ancient text, and you're trying to understand it. So the author's encyclopedia, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, God, I think knew what he was doing, but we are not telepathic. I can't just beam ideas straight from my brain into yours. I have to use some kind of medium. So I use my encyclopedia to create a text, which is some form of communication, and then you have to do something with it, which is why I have a double arrow going from reader's encyclopedia to the text, because it's not as simple as just taking the text in. We also bring things to the text, and we need to be aware of that. So what we're going to be doing through the rest of this class is developing tools to help us reshape and expand our encyclopedia to more closely map onto the encyclopedias of the people who wrote the Bible. And today we're going to develop our first tool for doing that, and this is what I'm calling it. We're simply going to be aware that semantic range exists, and we're going to try to find patterns in what we read. This is a skill. but it's a skill that all of you are already good at because you understand what I'm saying right now. This is how humans learn language. This is how you learned your first language. When you were 2, no one sat you down and said, okay, this is a present progressive verb. If you want to use it in the past tense, you need to add the ed to the end and all this. No one did that. What you did was you watched contexts, you followed patterns, and then you figured it out and tried it. And yes, there were many instances where you got something wrong and somebody had to correct you, but the vast majority of what you did is you simply just trial and errored your way into learning the entire English language. So we're going to do that same thing, but with the Bible. We're going to watch for patterns in context, and we're going to let those patterns inform the way we understand the semantic range of the words or ideas being used in those contexts. And if that sounds complicated or you don't understand what I'm talking about, I think you will once we do it in practice. I think this is actually a very intuitive and simple thing to do once you learn how to do it and you start thinking in these terms. So let's practice and you'll see what I'm talking about. We're going to begin with tracking one idea through several passages of Scripture, beginning in Genesis 1:31. God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day. This is, of course, from the creation narrative. At the end of every day, we get we get something like this. It's not identical across every day. Day 2, we don't get anything about God seeing and it being good. Day 7, we don't get anything about evening and morning, the 7th day. Day 3, we get 2, God saw that it was good, right? But in general, they all kind of wrap up this way. And then just a couple chapters later, we get the fall narrative. And this is what it says in Genesis 3:4-6. But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. We looked at this together as a class, and I was very happy that the class zeroed in on what I was zeroing in on, which is that every character in this narrative is talking about and or doing something with their eyes. So here we go. God sees everything that he has made, and behold, it is good. The serpent says, your eyes will be opened, and then Eve sees that the fruit is good and it's a delight to her eyes. And we noticed also that they're not merely seeing things, but they are seeing and evaluating. So God doesn't just see the world he has made, but he sees that it is good. The serpent promises that when your eyes are opened, that is when you will be able to know good and evil. And Eve sees that the tree is good and desirable, and so on. We also noticed that when God sees that his creation is good, we can trust that judgment. God is right. He's God. But when Eve sees that the fruit is good, she's not right. Now, it might have been a tasty fruit, but she was not right to eat it. It was the wrongest anyone's ever been about anything, you could argue. And so we notice there's a contrast being set up between what God sees and how he evaluates, and what human beings see and how they evaluate. And that seeing and evaluation is the same idea in Hebrew. So we're going to track this idea further, going next to the book of Judges. Not sure what happened there. That did not happen in class this morning. Okay. Judges. Judges 13:1 says this, "And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. The book of Judges is, of course, after the Israelites have been freed from slavery. They've been led into the promised land of Canaan, and in the book of Joshua we read that they are intended to wipe out or drive away all of the people groups that are living there, which they don't do. They do kind of a half measure. They get rid of some of them, and then they move in alongside the rest, which means that they are constantly under threat from these foreign peoples, both physically, like they go to war with them, but also spiritually, because they follow the influences of these people as well. And so you get this cycle in the book of Judges where Israel does something evil in the sight of the Lord, and then he gives them over to the Midianites or the Philistines or whoever it is. This one, in Judges 13:1, this introduces the story of Samson. And the first thing we see Samson do is he falls for a Philistine girl, which is a big problem for Israel because God explicitly told them not to intermarry with any of the Canaanite people groups. And so Samson goes to his dad, which is what you did at the time. You didn't propose to the girl. You went to your dad, and your dad talked to her dad, and then they set it up. So he goes to his dad, and he says, hey, there's this Philistine girl I'd like to marry. And his dad responds, both his parents, respond with this in Judges 14:3. But his father and mother said to him, is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives, or among all your people, that you must go take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. Now, Samson's a Danite. He's from the tribe of Dan. So his parents' first reaction is, isn't there a Danite girl? That's what they mean by daughters of your relatives. Or if not a Danite, at least somebody from Israel, right? Don't go after a Philistine person. But he insists, no, she's the one I want. She's right in my eyes. And this is Samson's first wife. This is not Delilah. And this is a little bit less well known. What happens next is Samson gives this riddle at the wedding. His new bride sells him out to save her own skin. And so he loses the bet. And he goes and he murders 30 random Philistine guys to settle up. These are not Philistine soldiers. They're just random people living their lives. And he goes and he murders them. And he takes their clothes and he pays off of his debt. And then he storms off. And the Philistines go, well, I guess we're never going to see that guy again. So his bride gets married off to his best man. You can't make this up. And then Samson cools off and he comes back to sleep with his wife only to find out she's been married off to somebody else. So this ticks him off even more. And he goes and he ties these foxes' tails together and puts a torch in between them and lights the torch on fire. So the foxes try to run away and they run through all the Philistines' wheat fields, destroying their crops so that they have nothing to eat. And that story always kind of cracks me up because, like, Samson could have just taken a torch and done it himself. He had to add animal cruelty to his list. But this ticks the Philistines off so much because their harvest is gone, that they go and they attack Judah. Remember, Samson is a judge. It's his job to save and protect Israel. But his actions create this escalating cycle of violence that culminate in the Philistines attacking Israel extra hard. They go on a crusade against Judah that they otherwise would not have done because of Samson. And it can all be tracked back to what this says in Judges 14:3. Get her for me. She's right in my eyes. And then the whole book of Judges ends with this phrase. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So I don't even need to highlight them for you, but there you go. Right? There's the pattern again. And take a look at Judges 13:1. The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. You don't need that clause. They did what was evil. Period. Why even mention that it's in the sight of the Lord? This is redundant. Unless you're trying to establish a contrast between what God sees and what human beings see. Let's look at one more. My goodness, what is going on? There we go. So this is from the book of 1 Samuel. Saul is king, but David has been anointed king in secret. And David's still young, he's a boy, and he goes and he kills Goliath. And right after that, Saul and David come back from the battle. Excuse me. And we get this little story in 1 Samuel 18:6-9. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, that is Goliath, the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, "Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s." And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, "They've ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on. Dun dun dun. I got a little chuckle this morning. But you see it, hopefully. There it is. Saul, whatever Saul's about to do, it's not good news. Because the last 2 times we've seen somebody seeing or eyeing something, it was Samson beginning his cycle of violence and Eve triggering the fall. Are you tracking with me? Hopefully. I can't see your eyes. I don't like this, but here we are. So, here are my thoughts. The concept of eyes or looking at or seeing something in the Bible seems to be connected with sinning, doing the wrong thing, misjudging a situation, at least when a human being is the one doing the same. There is a stark contrast between what God sees and what humans see. Whenever I read, oh my goodness gracious, I apologize for this. There we go. Whenever I read about someone seeing or something being right in their eyes, I start to sweat a little bit. And notice, if we had started with 1 Samuel 18, I don't know if we would have picked up on this. People start favoring David over Saul. So Saul keeps an eye on him. Reasonable thing to do. But if you have Judges and Genesis in the back of your mind, you hear Saul eyed David and you go, "Oh, whatever you're thinking, Saul, don't do it." Because you're tracking with the pattern. So my English speaker encyclopedia is completely neutral on the idea of seeing. I don't have a negative connotation with it. But I think we're picking up on something in the Hebrew imagination, the Hebrew encyclopedia, which says, so-and-so saw something, and the audience goes, uh-oh, not going to end well. This is what I'm talking about. And again, I think if the more you do this, the more you practice this, you'll get a feel for seeing this sort of thing for yourself. Let's do another one. This is from the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah lived at the time of the Babylonian exile. So what happened was, for generations, the nations of Israel and Judah were meant to be representatives of God to the world. They did a terrible job. God gave them millions of chances to change their ways, and they continued to choose not to. And so finally God allowed the Babylonian Empire to come through, to conquer Judah, lay siege to Jerusalem, destroy the temple, slaughter people, and take the survivors away as slaves. And I invited the class this morning to try and put ourselves in Jeremiah's shoes for a second. Because you read about ancient things and it's easy to kind of distance yourself from it. So let's imagine what Jeremiah saw. Think that the U.S. goes to war with a foreign nation and we lose. That nation comes in to Knoxville, destroys our landmarks, burns down our government buildings, guns people down in the street, takes away your sisters and daughters for all the reasons you might imagine. I mean, this is a horrific event. It's terrible. And in response, Jeremiah writes this poem. He says, I looked at the earth, and it was empty and formless. I looked at the heavens, and there was no light. I looked at the mountains and hills, and they trembled and shook. I looked at all the people were gone. All the birds of the sky had flown away. I looked at the fertile fields, and they had become a wilderness. The towns lay in ruins, crushed by the Lord's fierce anger. This is what the Lord says. The whole land will be ruined, but I will not destroy it completely. The earth will mourn, and the heavens will be draped in black because of my decree against my people. I have made up my mind and will not change it. I asked the class this morning to see if there were any bells going off in their heads. And we eventually got to recognizing that this is the language of Genesis 1, of the creation narrative. The earth was empty and formless. Formless and void is the typical translation that you're probably familiar with. In Hebrew, it's tohu vavohu. I looked at the heavens, and there was no light. In Genesis 1, God says, let there be light, but Jeremiah doesn't see any. I looked, and all the people were gone. What happens there in Hebrew, it literally says, there was no Adam. No human, no Adam. The birds of the sky were gone, the plants were gone, and again, the sky was black, no light. Now, is Jeremiah saying that it was a cloudy day, like he couldn't see the sun? I think obviously no. First of all, this is poetry, but more than that, he's intentionally using familiar language, the language of creation, to express what he's feeling. So here's my thought on that. If it'll pull up. Come on. Oh my goodness. There we go. The destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon is not the end of the world. But for Jeremiah, it might as well be. So he's taking the language of Genesis 1 and he's flipping it on its head to show God is decreating, destroying everything that matters to Jeremiah. This is heavy stuff, but the point that I'm trying to get at is, if you didn't have Genesis 1 on the brain, this would be a very confusing poem. Well, what does he mean there's no light? Did they burn all of the crops? Why does he say the land is a wilderness? There were no people? Well, he's there. What does he mean there's no people? It's confusing, but if you have Genesis 1 on the brain, all this meaning just opens up and you go, oh, of course. It's the end of the world. The sky is falling, right? I've got one more example I want to look at before I close. This is from 1 Kings 3, 5 through 9. Solomon, David's son, has just become king. And there's no temple yet. So he goes up onto a high mountain called Gibeon to sacrifice to the Lord, and he sacrifices like 1,000 bulls because he's the king and he can spare to do that. And this is what it says. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask what I shall give you. And this is, I think, the only time in Scripture that God acts like a genie. He comes to Solomon, he goes, you get one wish. What do you want? And Solomon said, you've shown great and steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart towards you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father. Although I'm but a little child, I don't know how to go out or come in. and your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? Now, there's probably a ton in here that we could focus on. But the part that I want to focus on is toward the end. And I'm realizing now that the way I'm recording this, I'm probably blocking it with my head, but I'm going to go ahead and highlight it. It's this part here that says, Solomon asks for the ability to discern between good and evil. We often remember this as Solomon asks for wisdom, which is a good synopsis, but it's not what it says. The word wisdom is not used in here in English or in Hebrew. What he asks for is an understanding mind to discern between good and evil, which should ring a bell because we already read that this morning. This is Genesis 3 again. And if you think about it, these are actually very similar situations. Adam and Eve are set up to rule. God tells them, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and so on and so forth. Solomon is also set up to rule. He's just been made king of all Israel and Judah. Are they going to need to be able to discern between good and evil? Yes, obviously they do. If you don't have a leader who knows the difference between good and evil, that's how you get a Hitler. Someone who thinks that genocide is a good thing. You want your leaders to know good from evil. And they both try to get it. Adam and Eve try to get it, and Solomon tries to get it. When Adam and Eve try to get it, things don't go very well. God is not happy, to put it mildly. And when Solomon asks for wisdom, God is ecstatic. I don't have it on here, but the next verse is, God gives him a big old attaboy and says, you could have asked for money or long life or for me to kill your enemies, and you didn't ask for any of that, so I'm going to give you what you asked for, but I'm also going to give you all that other stuff that you didn't ask for because I'm so proud of you. You made the right call, bud. So what's the difference, right? You have one instance where a ruler's trying to get the knowledge of good and evil, and God goes, nope, don't like that. And then you've got another instance where a ruler is trying to get the knowledge of good and evil, and God goes, yes, that's right. What's the difference? Our class, very quickly this morning, discerned that Adam and Eve take the knowledge of good and evil, where Solomon asks for it. So let me spell that out a little bit here. Oh my goodness gracious. I'm so sorry. I don't know why this is happening. Here we go. So 1 Kings 3, I think, is in direct conversation with Genesis 3. In lit theory, this is called intertextuality. It's the idea that texts, that remember that medium of communication, don't exist in isolation, but they always exist in conversation with other texts, and they actually comment on each other. They inform each other in meaningful ways. And so if you just read Genesis 3, you would be forgiven for thinking, I guess God doesn't want humans to know right from wrong. I mean, we tried to get the knowledge of good and evil. That was the one thing God forbid. Don't eat the knowledge of good and evil. And then we try to get it, and then God's mad. So I guess we're not supposed to know. But then you keep reading, and you get to 1 Kings 3, and you have another ruler who asks God for the knowledge of good and evil, and God is over the moon about it. And then you go, oh, we do need to know good and evil. The question is, how are we going to get it? Are we going to try to take it for ourselves? Or are we going to ask God for it? So, let's review briefly what we're doing here. This is our first tool for expanding our biblical encyclopedias. All we've done this morning is tracked patterns that are in the Bible itself and try to let those inform our encyclopedia. So, when you read this way, the more you do it, you start to actually let the Bible shape your mental encyclopedia. Remember, we didn't have a negative connotation with I before we started doing this. Right? You might not have tracked as closely with the ideas of knowledge of good and evil. Maybe you didn't pick up on the Genesis 1 language in Jeremiah, right? You start reading this way, you'll start seeing these connections across every part of the Bible. And I think the whole Bible is talking to itself, and every one part is informing all the other parts. Again, this is called intertextuality in lit theory. You don't really need to know that term, but it is a thing that people study. And finally, I want to touch on this metaphor. So this is, I think, is a very helpful metaphor that I've heard. One way to think about this way of reading is to think of these patterned of words as hyperlinks. So if you spend any amount of time online, you know what a hyperlink is. You're reading on a page, and it's usually blue, this highlighted word that's underlined. It kind of jumps out from the page. And if you go and click on it, what happens is a whole new world of information opens up. It takes you somewhere else, and you learn a ton more information. That's how one way you can think about what this is that we're doing. So when you read 1 Samuel 18 and you get to Saul eyed David, that eye should light up, and in your brain you should click back to, so to speak, Judges and Genesis and go, oh no, Saul, don't eye David. That's not going to end well. So that's what we're doing. And I ended this morning by beginning a process which I did not finish. So next week, we're going to jump into the middle of this conversation. But I think it's important, and that's why I even started it today. So if you missed today, and you're going to be there next week, this is doubly important that I'm recording this, because you're going to be a little bit lost if you try to jump in the middle of this. Basically, I'm trying to prove that I'm not making this up. These are things that I noticed for myself, but in the methodology I'm using to get there, I didn't make up. It's not my own idea. And personally, I think the results speak for themselves. When you start to read this way, so much just starts clicking and making sense that it has to be, we have to be onto something. But there's more to it that I want to use to kind of defend why it is that we can read this way. And to do that, we have to talk about biblical poetry. This is Psalm 1:1, the very first psalm that you would read if you opened up the book of Psalms. And it says, "Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers." Why did they say that 3 times? And you're reading that in English, and you're going, okay, yeah, I get it. Let's move on, right? And in English, this would be poor writing. I would take points off. I'm an English teacher. And this is redundant. You don't need to say all that in English. But biblical poetry works very differently than English prose. Shocker. So this is what we identified this morning. Those 3 lines, they're not identical. So what actually is the difference? Well, in the first one we see don't walk. In the second we see don't stand. And in the third we see don't sit. So you think about that a little bit and you realize, if I'm walking along with somebody and I decide I don't want to be with that person, I can say, all right, well, I'll see you later, and just walk the other way. If I'm standing and having a conversation with somebody, suddenly it's harder to extricate myself. I got to come up with an excuse, I think I heard Mandy calling for me. I'm gonna, I'll see you. And if you're sitting with someone, now you're in it. I mean, that's a hard situation to get out of gracefully. And so I think what we're looking at here in Psalm 1 is this is a slow fade. And the author is telling you, look, don't even go walking with them. I know it's easy to get out then, but over time, you're going to end up standing, and then you're going to end up sitting. You're going to be one of them. If you go with the wicked, you will be wicked yourself. I think that's what we're reading here. So, In English, when you read poetry, not universally, I know, but in general, the key features of poetry in English are meter and rhyme. So very simply, roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. Yeah, meter and rhyme, rhythm and line endings that match each other. This is clearly not what's going on in Hebrew. Even in Hebrew, this doesn't rhyme, and there doesn't really seem to be any meter to it. Some people have said that they've found some, but there's no consensus on that. It appears to be what we would call freeform poetry. But they do have a poetic device that they lean on, like we lean on meter and rhyme. The key feature in Hebrew poetry is parallelism that invites comparison and contrast. And I found this beautiful explanation for it it's better than any explanation I could give, so I'm just going to read it. It is a long quote, so bear with me, but this is the best way I think it could be said. So this is from Reading Biblical Poetry, an Introductory Guide by J.P. Fogelman. And he says this: "The parallel lines of biblical poetry are like a pair of binoculars. For some centuries, the lenses of a field glass were set in cylinders that could be slid in and out, but they remained in a single tube. The lookout on a ship looked through it with one eye. Today's field glass is a binocular. We look through two cylinders with both eyes, so that we have the advantage of seeing depth." Seeing depth. Our eyes, with or without binoculars, see in stereo. The effect results from the fact that one eye has a slightly different angle than the other, and so produces a minimally different image. These two pictures are easily superimposed and assembled into one image inside our brain. And biblical parallelism does something comparable. This poetic device creates two subtly different images with two lines that are to be associated through parallel expression. They use the same words, they are talking about the same subject, they're literally right next to each other, like in Psalm 1:1. Something about them is parallel. This allows you the opportunity to consider both pictures separately and then let them sink in together. Only those who look closely and have patience will discover and savor the role played by dissimilarity, its surprises, and its richness of meaning. 1/3 of the Bible is poetry. I don't know about you, but I'm an English teacher, and I don't remember the last time I voluntarily read a poem. Unless we're talking music and lyrics, poetry is just not a big part of the zeitgeist in 2024 U.S. We just don't read poetry. But clearly, the biblical authors did. 1/3 of what they wrote and read was poetry. And this includes the New Testament. So if you're looking at just the Old Testament, it's a big percentage. These authors' minds were steeped in this way of thinking. When you want to be profound as an ancient Hebrew author, this is how you do it. You use this parallelism to invite comparison and contrast. And when you slow down, you zero in on, hey, this is like this, but they're not identical. What's the difference? When you nail down the difference, that's when the light bulb goes off and you go, oh, I see. So my experience is that this biblical parallelism is it's not restricted to the poems. It's the whole Bible. And I think we're really actually onto something when we look at 1 Kings 3 and Genesis 3 and go, boy, those situations are similar. What's the difference? Oh, one takes the knowledge, one asks for the knowledge. And that's where the theology happens, where the insight happens. And you go, boy, if I try to take and define good and evil on my own, it's not going to end well. I need to ask God to show me. And this morning I almost said, now the Bible doesn't come out and say this, and I realized at the last second that it actually does. In Proverbs, Solomon of course, Solomon writes, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding." So the Bible does come out and say this, but what we've done with 1 Kings 3 and Genesis 3 is a lot harder, and now we own that understanding. We had to work to get it by comparing these two parts of Scripture and finding the difference for ourselves. I really think we're on to something there, and we're going to continue to do this throughout the rest of the class. Now, I have more I want to say about this, about biblical poetry, and about how the Bible is put together. That's where we're going to start next week. But for now, that's all I got. I'm sorry about coughing and about not having the original recording and about all of the finicky projection stuff here. But thank you for bearing with me, and thank you for coming to this class. I hope you're getting as much out of it as I am. I'm really excited and honored to be able to share with others what God has been showing me and what I've been learning through this process myself. So thank you all. Thank you.